and we will be presenting on the Berbice Revolt of 1763. So let's find where Berbice is located. So the Berbice slave revolt occurred in the territory of Guyana, which is formerly called British Guyana. During this time, it was a separate colony, and the colony receives its name from the river. Guyana has four major rivers: the Corentyne, Berbice, Demerara, and Essequibo. They all flowed northward and emptied into the Atlantic. So between 1627 and 1796, Berbice was ruled by the Dutch, or we'd call them the Netherlands and the Hollands. Berbice was merged with Essequibo and Demerara, which ended up forming the colony of British Guyana in 1831. The colonial government was called the Berbice Association, and the population consisted of roughly 350 Caucasians and approximately 5,000 enslaved Africans. Now we'll have a small video on the Berbice Revolt, the causes of the Berbice Revolt.
Permanent colony in present-day Guyana. I say the Dutch were the first Europeans to establish a permanent colony in present-day Guyana. I say permanent because the story of European colonialism in Guyana is a long and messy one, as this 83,000 square mile piece of land has changed hands more times than a $100 bill at the stockbroker market. Limited supplies, disease, and harsh environmental conditions mean that the Dutch looked to the forced labor of Captain Africans as a means to survive, but they worked them to death. I mean, I'm not being dramatic. This is chattel slavery, folks. I mean, literally, the people were worked to death. Being thoroughly fed up with the treatment, by this point, an enslaved African named Kofi Badu decided enough was enough. It was clear to him that the Dutch needed to go.
Okay, so that brings us to our next point, the causes of the Berbice Revolt. So the first cause, which was one of the major causes, were the harsh treatment, which fueled the desire for revenge against white and permanent freedom. The main concern of the white plantation owners was only to extract the greatest amount of labor from the slaves. And so little effort was made to improve the wretched and degrading living conditions under which the enslaved were forced to live. Now, with the harsh treatments and the brutal punishments, that were inflicted on them by their owners, some of them rebelled, while others from time to time would escape the plantations. Those who were recaptured suffered horrible deaths and punishments, which were used as deterrents to other slaves who might have also planned to escape. Some of those in Berbice who managed to escape reached Suriname, where they ended up joining the Bush Negro colonies. Organizing a widespread rising and keeping a secret was very difficult, right? But generally, before they would do so, there had to be the opportunity, given at least the possibility of success. In some cases, there had to be a deterioration in what were already inhumane living conditions, which would affect many people. The second cause of the revolt was that slaves were underfed because their owners did not grow enough provisions on the estate. The first cause for dissatisfaction was a reduction in the normal rations, and by 1762 to 1763, Berbice slaves could no longer claim to be the best fed slaves in the Caribbean. One of the reasons for the shortage of imported foodstuff was from the 7 Years' War in Europe that occurred between 1756 and 1763. Those boats which came into Berbice at the beginning often brought supplies that were either spoiled or of very inferior quality. In addition, the winter of 1762 was an exceptionally hard one in the United Provinces. Many boat supplies could not leave the harbor, and so supply ships for Berbice were no exception. Those that were due to arrive at the end of 1762 did not even leave the port until the beginning of 1763. This problem of supplies affected company slaves such as private ones, and Van Hugenheim, the governor of the colony, was too alarmed by this. And so the governor's answer to the dilemma was local fish from the Kanji River, but this only proved partially successful. The next cause of the revolt was that the estates were often left in the hands of cool overseers who did not care about the welfare of the enslaved. The slaves gave for the uprising. The reasons was the cruelty of planters such as Anthony Burkage and his overseer Lillenberg, the widow Joseph New Caracas, Van Staden of Elizabeth and Alexandria, Gijs de Graaf of Hugenstraten, Burger Captain Van Legslin of Margaretha Christina, and Johan Del of Juliana. Of course, there were many other planters, but these are the ones that stood out to many historians. There were also some company servants on the list, although none of these were plantation directors or Negro officers. Several planters, as named before, were guilty of extreme brutality to their slaves. And one of the unusual features about Berbice was that the nature and frequency of punishments could vary considerably from one plantation to the next, meaning that some plantations had different degree of punishment, but it was still barbaric and brutal. The slaves were too conscious of these differences and distinguished good and bad planters. It is likely that the incidence of brutal punishment would increase on some plantations prior to 1763. And so the planters were too nervous and the slaves were very uncooperative because they were facing shortage of rations. And in that case, the slaves would have experienced a genuine deterioration in all aspects of their daily lives before the uprising. If you don't have food, you cannot work. And if you have no use to them, they will kill you. Next, we move on to the role of diseases. As governor of the colony, Van Hugenheim wrote that the situation in Berbice was still horrible. The predominant disease, which almost certainly was dysentery, developed worse than ever. It had already taken the lives of 2 council members, Emmanuel Hosch and Charbon, and quite a few directors of the societal plantation. And so the Court of Police and Criminal Justice no longer had adequate number of members to hold meetings. He further remarked that, with the exception of 10 men, all soldiers at the fort had succumbed to the diseases or were gravely ill, and he urged for more soldiers and European staff to be dispatched to the colony. Now we'll have a small video on the course of the revolution.
It is the morning of February 23rd, 1763. The slaves on plantation Magdalenburg in the Kanji River revolt against their Dutch masters. They killed the estate manager and several others, loot and set fire to buildings. They then stormed the nearby estate of La Providence with similar success. News of the Kanji revolt spreads like wildfire to the several dozen plantations along the Berbice River. By sheer coincidence, the captive Africans there, under the leadership of Kofi, had been secretly planning a massive rebellion of their own. The Kanji revolt triggers the Berbice River slaves into action. They rise up in unison on several estates. The Great Berbice Slave Rebellion has started. The revolutionaries have one clear objective in mind: to achieve their total liberation by expelling the Dutch from the entire colony of Berbice. If all goes according to plan, this would be the first successful slave revolt in history. At the dawn of the year 1763, Berbice is a Dutch-owned colony, administered separately from Demerara and Essequibo. All of its lands are owned by Dutch merchants in a joint stock company called the Society of Berbice. They established 11 sugar estates along the Berbice River, such as Dagorad, Preboom, and Savonnet. The Society of Berbice offers land for leasing to Dutch citizens interested in setting up plantations in the colony. Several families from Holland take up the offer. By 1763, over 80 private estates are operating along the Kanji and Berbice rivers. These include Magdalenburg, Hollandia, Vigilante, Lilienburg, and Zeelandia. Captive Africans are the main workforce on both the private and society estates. In 1763, in the colony of Berbice, the seat of government is in New Amsterdam, situated 12 miles up the Berbice River. Just next to it is Fort Nassau. The Dutch governor of Berbice is Wilfred Simon van Hugenheim, an extremely resolute Dutchman. His strong sense of duty in the face of chaos and calamity is to play a major role in shaping events along the Berbice River in the coming months. Prior to the Great Berbice Slave Rebellion, the population in the colony is put at just over 300 Europeans and 4,000 captive Africans. Also present in the colony are Amerindians. They too are to have a significant impact on the eventual outcome of the 1763 slave rebellion. By late February 1763, the revolutionaries are in control of all the plantations in the upper Berbice above Fort Nassau. That Coffee could mastermind in total secrecy so massive an operation across so many estates testifies to his talents as a soldier, organizer, and leader.
So what you just saw was a video giving a little bit more backstory to the Berbice Revolt and starting off the course of the revolution. So, as she stated, in February 1763, the enslaved Africans in Berbice, led by Kofi, revolted and fought for their freedom. It was not the first time they had done so. And between 1733 and 1762, the colony had an ongoing history of rebellion and protest. The Africans here killed the plantation managers and some other officers before moving on to the neighboring La Providence plantation. Like most of the African rebellions, the war began as an action on one estate and then spread to the other estates. The first estate was Plantation Magdalen on the Kanji River. Within 2 weeks, enslaved persons were rebelling on most estates on both the Kanji and Berbice rivers. Many Dutch were killed and taken prisoners as the rebels moved from plantation to plantation. From the end of February until early December 1763, Africans took charge of the colony and were in command of its government. Heavily armed Dutch troops arrived in November, and after many bloody battles, they defeated the rebels by December 10. When the enslaved people were in command of the government, they immediately began the task of nation building. The first thing they did was to build a new government. Now, Kofi became the governor of the colony, and his second in command during the war was Captain Accra. Both men were Akan men from Ghana. Accra was appointed a deputy governor, and they took up residence in the prestigious council house at Fort Nassau with all the official staff and ceremony. Following his installment, Kofi wrote a series of letters to the defeated Governor Hugenheim. The letters set out the anti-slavery policies of his government and at the same time indicated a willingness to recognize the interests of Dutch outside of Berbice. In May, he wrote the former governor and sent him a gift of gold buckles as a token for the inconvenience he had suffered. He indicated that there was no personal animosity towards him and all he wanted was the enslaved's freedom. While a letter in May was on its way to Guggenheim, groups in coffee camps were already planning further military assaults on Dargat, the only remaining significant Dutch settlement in Berbice. Now, this group was led by Atta, also from Ghana. Atta and his group wanted complete freedom of all enslaved in the colony. And so the leadership of the freedom struggle was divided and broken into two separate camps that were now at war with each other. One group declared Atta as his governor, saying that Kofi was a compromiser and a betrayer of the cause. And the other group supported Kofi. June 1763 became a period of warfare between Africans. Most of Kofi's supporters were killed because Atta had the support of the majority, since he had a total policy of total war against all enslavers. Atta became governor after he won. He selected a military council made up of other well-known soldiers: Kweku, Bab, Akab, Keys, Gusari, Fortwin, Kwabina, and a few others. He did not seek to negotiate with the Dutch, but he declared war on their settlements and military installation. Atta had enough. Africans increasingly took the form of ethnic bonding, and Akab became the leader of a 600-strong Bantu group, while Bob took the command of the Gwango people. But at the same time, ethnic divisions increased, and the general tensions between Africans born in Africa and the Creole rose. In fact, suspicion and the tension between Africans and Creoles were the main reason for armed conflict between African communities on the Berbice and Kanzi rivers. And by February 1764, one full year after the war was started, the Dutch were back in full possession of the colony of Berbice. The Dutch put the remaining leaders to death after the Court of Criminal Justice had issued its judgment. The revolution was defeated, but many Africans had enjoyed at least a period of freedom. For a year, they were effective rulers of their own country. Now, the revolution is over. What are the effects? You had increased punishment and restriction on the enslaved people. The planters placed tighter restrictions on the remaining enslaved, and the local troop or militia was increased. According to the historian Alvin Thompson, enslavers tortured those who were captured alive, ripping out their flesh in an effort to send a strong message to the other blacks that, listen here, if I catch you, you're next. Another effect was that, again, many slaves were killed. Between the months of March to April in 1764, 40 slaves were hanged, 24 slaves were burned, 24 broken at the wheel. No, the wheel was a torture method that was used for public execution by breaking the bones or bludgeoning them to death. What were the social effects of the Berbice Revolt? Again, half the slave population was killed. It took more than 10 months to recapture the colony from the slaves, and during which more than 1,800 Africans were killed. More than half the white population was killed. Whites fled the country in fear of losing their lives and their plantations, and they fled from their plantations. You had psychological trauma on the whites, meaning fears of black enslaved people resorting to uprisings dominated the thoughts of European families on the Dutch plantations. They all looked over their shoulders wondering, oh, when is the next enslaved African going to kill me? When is me and my family going to die, right? Other effects of Berbice were that February 23rd now became the National Day of Guyana. And in 1970, when Guyana became a republic, coffee is chosen as a national hero. To your right, you have a statue or a replica of coffee, although some sources say coffee did not look anything like this statue, but it's the thought that counts. Economic disruption. You had the disruption of property, plantation, buildings. Debt increased to merchant bankers, and this all resulted in a loss of profits. They were no longer making as much money. Now we move on to key figures in the revolution. You had von Hugenheim, which, as we stated before, was the Dutch governor of Berbice. Atta, the Akan man who overthrew Coffee to be leaders of the rebels, and you had Governor Storm van Gravesand of Esquibo and the Demerara colony. We saved the best for last. Who was Coffee? Coffee was an Akan slave who was transported to the Dutch colony of Berbice, which is present-day Guyana. He was living in a plantation in Lilienberg on the Kanje River, and he and his followers seized artillery and gunpowder and then proceeded to take over the plantations in his community and those within close vicinity. He was born in Ghana, West Africa, and the historians quoted that the exact date of his birth is unknown, as was many captured Africans. He was captured from his native land, and he eventually ended up as a house slave of a barrel maker. On February 22, 1763, he, armed with weapons and numerous slaves, overtook plantations in Berbice and surrounding areas. Coffee was a skilled fighter, and he classified himself as leader of the slave and declared himself as the leader of Berbice, of the head of Berbice. This is the end of Group 1's presentation on the Berbice Revolt. Thank you for listening.
All right, very good presentation. The next group, beautiful Barbados.
So you mean Berbice?
No, next group. The next presentation is Barbados. I'll give the comments at the end of the class because it's now 9:32.
Sir,
Yes?
can we share screen?
It's already sharing, so you can go ahead. You can share it.
Sir, can you share?
Maisha, can you share it? Because mine's not working. I don't know why. Anybody else share it from group? Because mine's not working.
What is the issue? Who's
Mine's
mic?
No, my mic is fine. My screen's just not coming up, so I'm asking if anybody else can share it.
Anybody else in the group want to share the screen?
I'll share it.
Thank you.
Who said she'll share it?
Santo.
Okay, you have it. She have the PowerPoint and the video also, right?
Yes, sir.
Go ahead.
I'm coming. Are you guys seeing it?
It's still loading.
Not as yet. Are you guys seeing it now?
No.
Not
It's still
yet.
loading. Okay, it's up. Just like put it in present mode.
Yes.
Okay, so that's ready. Good morning. We're group 2. I will be presenting on the Barbados Revolution of 1816. My group members.
Barbados slave revolt. A
Okay.
revolution. All right, go ahead. Go
Our group
ahead.
members entail myself, Ashley Clary, Naisha White, Giselle Nelson, Christian Irons, and Chantel Bantam. This is a statue currently in Barbados of Bussa that was made in 2011. The colony of Barbados. Barbados was a British colony since 1627, and it was one of the first territories to cultivate sugarcane in the West Indies, as the sugar revolution also began in Barbados and spread throughout the rest of the Caribbean colonies. Barbados also had a colonial government that was elected by the planters with an appointed governor.
The Barbados Rebellion, also known as the Bussa Rebellion, was the largest slave revolt in the history of Barbados. It received its name from the African-born slave Bussa, who led the uprising. This was the first of the three major uprisings that happened in the British West Indies between the U.S. abolition of the slave trade in 1807 and general emancipation by the British in 1838.
Okay, so what were the causes of the Barbados Revolt? Firstly, desire for permanent freedom. The enslaved in Barbados felt as if a revolt was the only source of freedom because maroonage on the island was difficult due to the flat terrain. Secondly, harsh treatment inflicted by white society. Slavery in Barbados was no different than slavery in other countries. They too were beaten and abused by the white society. Thirdly, they were inspired by the success. Thirdly, activities of nonconformist missionaries. The missionaries taught the slaves how to read, and through this literacy, they were able to read about European disputes and revolutions, which led them to believe that it was time to fight for their freedom. Secondly, the nonconformist missionaries and abolitionists gave the enslaved the moral justification for the revolt. Next, they were inspired by the success of the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution of 1791 to 1804 was a successful revolution which led to Haiti becoming the first Black country in the Western Hemisphere to abolish slavery. The success of this revolt, which was often mentioned by Nanny Grigg, encouraged the slaves to fight for their freedom. Political consciousness among the enslaved. Approximately 80% of Barbados was Black, and so the enslaved thought that it was a Black man's island. The enslaved therefore wanted to create a Black country. The only way they could do this would be to fight for their freedom. Next, the role of elite slaves. Elite slaves were given privileges, such as living in larger huts. They used this to their advantage in planning the revolt. Jackie, Johnny, and King Wilshire were a part of the elite slaves. Bussa, who was among the elite slaves, was an African-born slave who led the revolution. Misinterpretation of the Registry Bill. The slave trade had been abolished in 1807. In 1815, the British Parliament came up with an imperial registry bill to register all slaves so as to monitor the treatment of slaves and to stop excessive cruelty. The planters were infuriated over the passing of this bill and saw it as an interference in their domestic affairs. The slaves misinterpreted this as the overseers being angry about a plan for their emancipation. The enslaved therefore decided to take action against their own freedom.
The course of the Barbados Revolution.
Revolt, you're still making the mistake.
Sorry.
Wars, revolts.
Go ahead.
Wars, revolts, or ambushes don't just start out of the blue. There has to be a bit of planning before any movement or gesture can be made.
The planning and organizing of the Barbados Revolution began in February because the Barbadian House of Assembly rejected the Imperial Registry Bill in November 1815. The enslaved people got upset because they believed that this action would make their lives more difficult. So a part of the planning called forth first the choosing of the leaders on the estates. The Simmons plantation had Johnny Grigg, Nanny Grigg, and Jackie, and they were all enslaved. The Bailey plantation had King Wilshire, Dick Bailey, Johnny, and Bussa, and they were also enslaved. The enslaved people were also assisted by three free literate black men. They were King Davis, Roach, and Richard Sargent. King Davis and Richard Sargent both met with slaves on coastal plantations, helped coordinate rebellion plans, and shared rumors. This mobilized the rebels in the central parishes such as St. Thomas, St. Joseph, and St. George. The planning ended at the River Plantation on a Good Friday night, April 12, 1816.
Okay, now the course of the rebellion. The rebellion began on Easter Sunday, April 14, 1816, and it was led by Bussa and Jackie. It broke out with the burning of several cane fields in the parish of St. Philip's, and this signaled to the rebels the beginning of the rebellion. The cane fields began burning rapidly throughout the island. The militia didn't intervene initially, however, 70 estates were burned and overseers ran away in panic. Next slide. Now, the rebellion spread from Christchurch, St. John, St. Thomas, St. George, and parts of St. Michael. As seen on the map showed before, you can see where it grew from and spread it to until it enveloped the entirety of Barbados, but not to a strong extent. They attacked imperial troops and plundered several estates, though martial law was passed on April 15, 1816. So the slaves were now suppressed by the militia and British troops, which ironically held black slaves among them. Suppression. The slaves did not have much of an advantage when the suppression began. The whites had guns and artillery which the slaves did not possess, which made it harder for them to fight back. The whites also had an advantage when it came to the flat topography of Barbados, as they used horses to aid them in catching the slaves. But the slaves, however, did not have the advantage, as they're more prone to be free in mountains and mountainous ranges. But as I said before, the topography in Barbados is flat. Also, majority of the slaves were expelled to Sierra Leone as punishment.
Positive effects. Bussa's leadership in the rebellion is marked by recognizing him as a national hero of Barbados. They thought that by him planning and helping in the revolt deemed him a national hero. It brought emancipation in the country 17 years later. It also brought the people together and made them become visible or have a voice like an enslaved African called Bussa and a domestic servant called Nanny Grigg. The revolution acted as a spur to further serious historical work on the legacies that the British were buying and owning slaves that and had them working on plantations. The day of the revolution is remembered and people of all ages, gender, race gather together at the site to remember the day and what the enslaved went through.
Negative effects of the Barbados Revolt. So there was a reduction in the population. The slaves undoubtedly lost with tragic and cruel losses of life. There was 176 enslaved Africans that died, including Bussa, one white civilian, and one black soldier. 70 enslaved were sentenced to death and executed in fields, and 50 enslaved people died in battle, while 170, no, go back, while 170 were deported to neighboring British colonies, like British Honduras. Another 300 were taken to Bridgetown for trial, of which 144 were executed. Free coloreds were given civil rights, which allowed them to testify against whites in courts. This was done to gain their loyalty. The white planters blamed the missionaries. William Shrewsbury church was damaged. Shrewsbury was forced to leave Barbados and take up refuge in St.
Oh my gosh.
The planters and the Assembly stake of putting the British revolt on the campaign in Britain to end slavery and on a number of British-born Christian missionaries in the Caribbean. Alleged rebels were also subject to the entire 80 days of March. There was destruction of property and cane fields. Over 70 estates were affected by the quick spread of cane fields. Acres of land was destroyed. According to the Assembly's investigative property damage accumulated to £175,000. Next. Chantal.
The video is next, but it's not.
You all right? So I'll share the video. Where it is here. You can close your screen now. Thank you.
I was unmuted.
Barbados Revolution.
Are you seeing the video now?
Yes, sir.
Good, good.
Of 1816. Here is a little overview. Barbados was a colony of the English since 1627, and one of the first West Indies territories to cultivate sugar. Barbados also had a colonial government that was elected by the planters.
The Barbados Revolution, also called the Bussa Revolution, was named after the African who led the uprising. Bussa. It was also the largest slave revolt in Barbados.
The causes of the revolution. Firstly, the slaves were brutally abused and overworked by the white overseers, which stemmed their anger to revolt. Secondly, the slaves greatly desired revenge for this harsh treatment, and also that they could be free to do as they pleased without being ordered around and abused.
Thirdly, the success of our neighboring country Haiti convinced us that we could get the freedom we desired. And Nanny Greg made it clean we would get the assistance to do so. Fourthly, the missionaries present on our island taught my people and I how to read and write. And with that knowledge we had learned of Europe's disputes and of our withheld freedom.
Next, there was the political consciousness among the slaves. They felt that Barbados was black man land and wanted to create a black country. As 80% of the population was already black. Going down the list. We're nearly there. Now. The elite slaves were given more privileges on plantations they had. Larger huts and more free will. Bussa, Jackie and King Wilshire were among the few.
The British slave law was abolished in 1807. The slaves, however, saw this as emancipation. The Registry Bill was a written law that slave owners had to register their slaves. Though the planters were angry in response to this, the Registry Bill was actually passed to decrease the rate of illegal slave sales and excessive punishments.
The rebellion began on April 14, 1816. Led by Bussa and Jackie. The rebellion broke out in the parish of St. Philip's, which signaled to the other rebels to begin the revolt. The burning of cane fields swarmed throughout the island. During the first stage they were not affected by the militia, and burnt over 70 estates and forced out the whites in a wild panic. Then, martial law was passed on April 15, 1816, which meant that any slave outside a plantation would be shot on the spot. So the rebels were suppressed by the local militia and British Imperial troops. The slaves were suppressed through superior weapons, as they did not have guns like the whites. Martial law forced them to go back to their owners or die. The flat topography made it easier for them to catch the slaves. They also used horses to aid them. And lastly, they deported several slaves to Sierra Leone and separated them.
To close, the effects. Bussa is now seen as a national hero in Barbados, and that revolt served as a major key to their emancipation. The day is now remembered up to this day, and the people who fought are reflected and acknowledged. Even so, with the good, there is bad. The slave population was significantly reduced. The missionaries were blamed for the revolt and William Shrewsbury Church was burnt and he was run out the island. The rebels were flogged and beaten during the entire 80 days of the martial law. There was also a significant reduction in the cane fields. Thanks for listening and we hope you learned something new.
All right, ladies. Thank you. You're hearing me, correct?
Yes, sir.
Good. All right, thank you very, very much for your presentations. Barbados and Berbice. Berbice went first. I see that Berbice would have done quite a lot of research for their presentation. They went beyond the call of duty, lovely evidence and examples, especially when looking at the course of the revolt. You did well in terms of the material and the content that was presented, all right? For Barbados, I realized that the PowerPoint that I would have sent to you, you would have just remodeled the PowerPoint and use it. However, the video, your group would have received an edge when it comes to the video because your video was original. You went and you did the video by yourself, and that gave your group an edge. Or not really an edge, but that was a plus for your group. So both presentations were excellent presentations. I know it's very difficult to present, and I hope the students in the class would have learned something from the presentation. Ladies, please note that next week, Monday and Tuesday, we're off because it's gonna be the holiday. However, you will receive a test over the, you're going to get a test on Friday. You're going to get a test on Friday and you're supposed to complete that test for next week, Wednesday. So you have quite a long time to do the test. The test will be a multiple choice. I'm not kidding you. I'm not stressing you out. I understand I feel stressed myself and I know that you are also stressed. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to give you some multiple choice on the different slave revolts that we are going through now, because you must understand the slave revolts that you are doing right now. All right, that is the only way I know if the presentations were effective. All right, ladies, go ahead, Thorpe.
So, sir, granted, as much as I would not appreciate a test, I appreciate that it is multiple choice. Question,
I said it's multiple choice.
That's what I'm saying, sir. I appreciate that it is multiple choice. My question is, will we have access to these presentations? Because they were really good. And while they were reading, I couldn't, like, as much as I saw your presentations, I thought like their stuff had like little things that I could take note of. I was wondering if we'd have access to their presentations as well.
Yes, so what I will do is that I will send my I have my PowerPoints. And so what I'm going to do also is that I'm going to send their PowerPoints to the entire class. Also remember, ladies, that we also have the uploading. Is uploading record? The recording. So it's always good to go back to the recording.
Yes,
I'm studying now, and I'm so happy for recordings because I go back over my classes during the week. I usually have a class on a Tuesday, and I take maybe on a Friday, and I just go through, listen back the recording and make my notes. So you can do the very same. It's going to be very effective because not everything is going to be said on a PowerPoint. All right? Ladies, enjoy the rest of the day. See you tomorrow. Tomorrow we're going to see Demerara and the others, Jamaica, but I've not received the presentation from Osborne. It's not in my email.
Yeah, I sent it.
You send it to O'Neill.hall?
Yes, sir.
All right. I'm seeing it now. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
The draft, you're asking about the draft. When are we getting back the first draft? You will get back the first draft before you go off holiday in November.
Cheese and peas.
It's a lot of work that I'm doing.
Holiday November, sir? Okay.
Yes, by the end of November, you'll get the first draft. So that means that you will get to do the work over the Christmas, and then you submit your final in January. And from what I'm seeing thus far, is not a lot of work that you have on most of the SBA. All right, ladies, enjoy the rest of the day.
Yes, sir.
Bye-bye.